Thank you, Professor Albrecht. Our next speaker is Professor Ron Haris. Professor Haris is a professor of legal history and the dean of our faculty, the Faculty of Law of Tel Aviv University. Professor Haris is the author of Industrializing English Law, Entrepreneurship and Business Organization, 1720 to 1844. And another book of Israeli Law, The Formative Years, 1948 to 1977. Professor Haris will speak now on the Comenda, Origins, Migration, Modifications, which is a chapter of his book, The Birth of the Business Corporation East and West, the Organization of Eurasian Trade for 1400 to 1700, forthcoming Princeton University Press.
Don't mention the year.
I will stop here.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Elimelech. I think this conference is, in a way, an expected conference in terms of the overlapping interests of our two institutions. It's also a challenge in the sense that we have some differences in our academic cultures, in our academic conventions. For example, by the fact that you usually are reading out a text, a prepared text, whereas we often improvise based on a paper that we circulated in advance. So I'll take it to the utmost in sense of improvising. But as I noticed, the conversation, the discussion that follows these two presenters' session are being conducted on a common ground. So there is hope that we can actually bridge over these cultural differences that are partly because of different university cultures, partly because of the different legal cultures. We are now more Anglo-American kind of law school in several respects. Our legal system might be more Americanized in recent years. So part of the challenge is to speak across these differences. And I think that it's very important for us in Israel to reconnect to some of our German origins, and not just generally, but also, you don't read it correctly, Lina.
No, I thought it was very funny.
I know. So I meant the 50s.
Reconnecting Tel Aviv to Jerusalem.
Yeah, so in a way, I mean, the Israeli legal academia of the 1950s and 60s was dominated by German-educated jurists, whereas now it's like 70 or 80% American-educated jurists, and that's part of the challenge. So anyway, as part of improvisation, I'll not talk only about the paper that I pre-circulated. That is, I would like to provide a general sketch of the book project as a whole in order to make a sense of as to where the book chapter is located, then to briefly present the book chapter, and lastly, to make some connections between it and the theme of the conference, that's the theme of overlapping jurisdictions. Because the book chapter as such does not do it expressly, I thought that I would like to circulate that book specific chapter because I had a sense that I can get good feedback on that chapter from some of the participants here, including Albrecht and Uriel and some others. So this is the explanation for the selection of this specific book chapter. So anyway, and it's still very much a project in the making. So the general question I'm dealing with in the book project is the development of legal economic institutions that facilitate, support, enable long-distance Eurasian trade. That is, the trade along Eurasia, part of it overland, part of it oceanic. And the question is how the institutions were shaped that allowed the materialization of this trade. Roughly speaking, the period, as was mentioned, is 1400 to 1700. And in my view, as someone who is interested in institutions, that is, in legal economic institutions, this was the cutting edge or the frontier of institutional challenges of the early modern period. The challenges were the most severe the further you went, the more you crossed jurisdictions and sovereignties of rulers, the higher the risks, the higher the uncertainties, the longer the duration. So this was a very challenging task to organize Euro-Asian trade going on for thousands of miles with turnover time of 2, 3, 4, and even 5 years, and everything that one could imagine in between the origins and the destination. So this is the general, my general interest in long-distance Euro-Asian trade. And my specific take is to try and distinguish between institutions that were developed in interaction with the environment, that is, with the functional challenges that merchants had to deal with in a given environment, given trade environment, given political environment. That's one interaction I'm interested in. The other one is the migration of institutions. That is, institutions that were not developed in a certain locality, but rather were brought into that locality from some other localities. So the question is, how does one view the development of institutions, either through one mechanism or the other mechanism? And I'm using 3 prototypes. And the fourth one that does not exactly fit this 3 prototype categorization. So one type of institutions are relatively, I would say, simple institutions, maybe trivial in some sense institutions, more intuitive institutions that were developed in different civilizations, in different localities. So there were many origins for some of these basic institutions. For example, the loan, the basic agency relationship, possibly the basic partnership were designed or have developed, evolved over time in various locations along Eurasia. The second type of institutions I'm kind of trying to, or the second prototype I'm using for analytical purposes, obviously no institution fits exactly any of these prototypes. The second prototype is that of institutions that are relatively more complex, were developed in 1 or 2 locations and then migrated, transplanted, imported, exported, whatever you call them, from that specific region to some other parts of Eurasia. The third type is that of institutions that were developed in one locality but did not migrate, either because there was no demand for these institutions, which is which is somewhat less interesting from my perspective, or because there were some restrictions, prohibitions, resistance to the migration to other locations, and that's something I'm more interested in. So these are the 3 basic types. The fourth type, which I'm not sure how to fit into my scheme, is ruler-based institutions or state-based institutions. I'm not sure that we should use state. Ruler will be safer for this early modern period. And the next question is why some institutions were of the first type, some of the second, and some of the third type, and why institutions that proved to be good in solving problems of organizing, financing, managing, controlling long-distance trade in one locality did not migrate. That is, if they already proved themselves to be good, why didn't they migrate? So that's the general question. And more specifically, I'm interested in the business corporation, the joint stock business corporation, about which I will not be talking today. So my initial puzzle was how come the business corporation was developed in Northwestern Europe and not anywhere else? Why, after being developed in Northwestern Europe, it did not migrate to any other place in Eurasia for at least 300 years, even though it proved quite useful for the Dutch, the English, and a few others in Western Europe. So, and as much as the business corporation did not migrate, were there any functional equivalents for it that if we'll be looking deeper into China or India will identify as doing more or less the same things that the corporation can do in trade, but are just configured from different, configured differently, packed differently, are using different building blocks than the corporate conception as it was developed in Europe. And so today I will not address these questions with respect to the corporation. I think they are somewhat less relevant for our theme. They are not exactly questions that relate to overlapping institutions. I will today focus on the commander rather than the corporation. The commander is, for me, an ultimate type 2 institution, that is an institution that probably had only one origin, maybe two, but probably only one, and migrated throughout Eurasia. And I'll try to kind of see what can I say something about its migration and something about the connection between its migration and the overlapping of jurisdictions. And so the chapter that I've circulated, which is currently numbered as chapter number 6 of the book draft, is the second chapter in the part of the book that deals with type 2 institutions. The first chapter discusses a few other institutions that migrated in a less profound way. This kind of zooms in on the commander. The next one, chapter 7, takes 3 case studies in which the commander actually played out and worked with the commander and some other institutions in a richer context. And so I'll get to that chapter after presenting this chapter, and that chapter, in a way, better fit our theme of overlapping jurisdictions, but we have to go through this chapter first. So I think it was quite well known in the literature that the commander could be found in more than one locality. So traditionally, there was a belief among, I think, Italian economic and legal historians that the commander was invented in Italy, probably 11th, 12th century or so, in some Italian, mostly port cities, maybe Venice, Genoa, maybe Florence, a few other cities. There was kind of a conception among Islamic historians that something which is called the mudaraba, or some other is being called in some other terms in Islam, was invented in the Middle East in the early days of Islam. So these are two common wisdoms, and there was a strand in the literature that say that in fact the Italians copied the Islamic kirad or mudaraba. What I think I achieved in this chapter is showing that in fact the migration is much more widespread than just the Middle East and Italy. I think that the European part of the story is a bit more familiar. That is, the migration of the commander from Italy along the Mediterranean to France and northern Spain, and maybe across the Alps into Germany, maybe into the Low Countries. The Baltics are a separate story about which you are a leading expert. There was a question as to whether the commander at some point did show up in England despite its common law legal system of the time. The part of the migration but there are some missing pieces in that west migration as well that I'll mention briefly. The part of the migration east, I think, is much less familiar. That is, I was able to show how thanks to, mostly to the secondary literature, I didn't do the research myself, to show how the commander migrated eastwards into India, into Central Asia, how the commander was introduced among Armenian merchants, mostly in Persia and beyond Persia, how the commander migrated into the Mongolian territories, possibly the Indonesian archipelago, how it migrated into China. So these are the parts that were not well documented. So how did I achieve this? I think, first of all, because I looked on a larger scale, that is, rather than on a specific locality, as most legal historians do, on a kind of a Eurasian scale, or I mean, it's not a global scale, it's a Eurasian scale, and I was able to read more bodies of literature and finding them things that people did not identify before, or that people that historians of the locality were familiar with but never made the connections with other localities. So it's partly because I read widely, but it's partly, I think, because methodologically I kind of introduced some sort of a new insight, in my view, which is that one should not look at morphological comparisons as the ultimate methodology for determining whether there was a migration or not. That is, often the case is that the institution is not identical in its details, its configurations, in different jurisdictions, in different civilizations. There are differences. The question is, how do we evaluate the differences? And why are there differences? Because there is a process of modification in any importation. One could almost not find in kind of pre-modern times a copying of anything which is legal as it is. One can find, the concepts of transplantations within imperial colonial contexts are much more ones of copying or actually imposing from above or copying through some international harmonization. But in pre-modern times, that's not the mechanism. And this is why things are not identical to each other. And just to give you some kind of, go through some of these stations of modification, and then we'll see what we can do with them. So first of all, there is a debate as to whether the Islamic commander indeed originated in Islam or before Islam. Some would say that it did origin with some building blocks before Islam, in provincial Roman law, in ancient Middle Eastern law, or even in Jewish law. So whatever the case is, I think that one should understand that once Islam imported some building blocks and reconfigured them, it had to fit them into Islamic historical narratives, into Islamic jurisprudential canons, and so it couldn't look just as things have looked in Byzantine or Jewish or Sassanid sources, that's for sure. Once the commander was imported from Islam to Italy, as I believe is the case, it had to be fit into schemes of Roman law. Once it was imported into the Baltics, into the Hanseatic cities, it had to fit the fact that the Baltics were just moving from oral contracting, from mostly oral law, into written law. That's something that Gadi referred to earlier on. So one could not import into an oral commercial practice an institution in the same way as it was in a written context in Islam or even in Italy. When we look at the common law, we have to look for the commander in England through common law lenses. It will not show up there through notarial records. It will have to be looked for in different ways. If we are looking at Armenian merchants, I think, were always in a tension between having some Christian identity on the one hand and living in an Islamic environment on the other hand. So they were pretending to, I think, show that they imported the commander from Italy, even though they probably imported it from the Islamic environment. And this is why the commander in Armenian towns looked differently from Islamic commander. If you take it to the Mongolian rulers, they took it from what was mostly a private instrument into more of a public tool. So it had to go through some configurations. So, and we can go on with this. So every kind of migration involved also modification, also some resistance, some irritation that ended up with having a different type of institutions, institution, and we have to be aware of it when trying to kind of make up our minds whether an institution actually migrated or not. So the level of similarity that one should expect methodologically is lower than I think was assumed, and should be tailored to the specific modification that was likely to take place in any kind of shift of the institution. And then we have a problem of sources as well. That's another kind of methodological problem that was already mentioned in the previous session. And it's often the case that one could not find the same type of sources into in the place of origin and the place of reception. Let's say if in Islam you find mostly legal texts, in Italian cities you find mostly notarial records, notarial contracts. So one has to bridge the differences in the nature of sources before kind of concluding whether a migration did take place or not. So I think these are the kinds of insights I gained during this exercise, and based on which I kind of drafted this kind of pattern of migration of the commander from the Middle East all the way to the Baltics and England on the one hand, and all the way to Central Asia, China, and Indonesia on the other hand. I may have overread some migratory segments. This could be the case, but I'm not trying to be perfect. I'm trying to kind of suggest a new methodology, which I hope I did. So now, as to how to connect it to our theme, so that's the next chapter, chapter 7. I didn't want to give you... No, the one you didn't get to read, the one I will kind of take Uri by surprise by getting into, but that's an Anglo-American custom, I think. So I think that each of the three cases I mentioned, I mentioned in this chapter 7, the following chapter, shows up, demonstrates overlapping jurisdictions in somewhat different way. So the first case is of the Cairo Geniza merchants, mostly of the 11th and 12th century, merchants that were trading from old Cairo to India via Aden in Yemen, and were also trading to North Africa and probably even to Southern Europe. The second case study is that of Armenian merchants from New Julfa, a suburb of Isfahan in modern-day Iran, that traded all the way from Amsterdam and London to Manila, to India, Lhasa in Tibet, and all the way to Manila. The third case, and that's mostly 17th century, the third case study is that of Jewish merchants of Livorno, Italy, that traded mostly with, not only in the Middle East, in the Mediterranean, also with India, mostly with Goa, but this time around the Cape of Good Hope in the 17th and 18th century. So for each of these case studies, I relied on the secondary literature. The leading authority on the Armenian merchants is Sebu Aslanian, who was in this room in a conference a couple of years ago. The leading authority on the Livorno merchants is Francesca Triveletto, who was also in this room in that same conference. And there are many authorities on the Geniza records, starting with Goitan in the 50s and 60s and beyond, and some others as well. So what do I learn from the Geniza case study in terms of overlapping jurisdictions? I think that I can identify 5 basic types of overlapping jurisdictions in this case, and the identification of at least some of them relates to my project as a whole, that is to the idea that institutions also migrate. That institutions evolve over time and move from one space, from one locality to the other. So the first type of overlapping jurisdictions is that of institutional importation or migration of institutions. That is, one institution that could be found in one locality and could seem to be attractive to merchants in other locality was imported by them through learning by doing often to that other locality. That is, they brought the law and the institutions of one place to another place because they found it useful for their purposes in Eurasian long-distance trade, in my case. The second is coexistence in the same locality of merchants that was subjected to different jurisdictions, to different laws. And in the case of Old Cairo, Muslim merchants and Jewish merchants that were parallelly trading with India were subjected to different laws because Jewish law applied to mostly Jews were subjected mostly to Jewish law, whereas Muslims were subjected to Islamic law in the same locality. Then there was a third type of overlapping in jurisdictions, which in my view is a shopping in institutions. That is, within the same location, one could shop between sets of norms or between institutions. And in this case, it was mostly Jews who could shop. That is, Jews, the minorities could shop. The majority usually could not shop. The minority could either pick up Jewish institutions or the institutions of Islam, what was called Kirad el-Goyim, that is the commander of the Gentiles, was something that the Jews could opt into, despite the fact that they were Jews. Muslims often couldn't pick up Jewish partnership, for example, at will. Then a fourth type is that of forum shopping. Often Jews could opt out to Islamic courts or to Islamic tribunals, not exactly at will, because there were some prohibitions and possibly some communal sanctions, but Jews could do it. Muslims could do it, I believe, also to some extent, but to a more limited extent, the Jews or other minorities could do. When I'm saying it's not only Jews, Christians as well, Armenians as well could often do this. And the last type of overlapping jurisdiction I would like to refer to is kind of shopping for partners or agents. That is, in transactions between Jews, they could adopt an Islamic institution. In transaction between Jews, they could, one of the parties, or probably the party that was more likely to lose in the Jewish form, could turn to the Islamic form. But one could also initially, when forming relationships, select whether to match with Jews or with Muslims when, let's say, selecting agents or when selecting partners, whether they could either select unidenominal or unicultural partnership or agency relationship, or cross-cultural, cross-religious lines partnership or agency relationship. And obviously, once you cross the lines in this sense, you get yourself into a different type of jurisdictional configuration with different outcomes. So these are basically the 5 overlapping jurisdictions that I identified in the Geniza case study. It will be interesting to compare them, I think, to the kind of overlapping jurisdictions that were found by Albert and others in the European context. That is, when one looks at the Middle East, when one looks at the Indian Ocean, when one looks at Islamic environment, the options of overlapping jurisdictions are quite different from the ones that one could find, let's say, in Northern Europe, in the Baltics, on the Atlantic shores, or generally in Latin Christianity. So it would be interesting for me to get some responses on these differences by you, Ariel, or anyone else. Thanks. Thank you very much.
Okay.